Hi everybody, and welcome to the Emerging Minds in MHPN Infant and Child Mental Health webinar series. So this is the sixth webinar and final webinar in this series brought to you by Emerging Minds and MHPN. And for all the many hundreds and thousands of people who have tuned in over these six webinars, we thank you for your time and look forward to bringing you this webinar, which is around engaging with children and parents with complex needs and really looking at a systems approach to that. Welcome to the, I think it's just ticked over 500 of you who have joined into us, and for all of those viewers who are going to be watching us through the podcast, welcome. And before we start, Emerging Minds and MHPN wishes to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands across Australia, wherever you're joining us from. And we wish to pay respect to the elders past, present and future for the memories, the traditions and the hopes and the culture of Indigenous Australians. So, my name is Dan Moss and I'm really pleased to be facilitating this webinar. It's a really interesting topic and I think certainly something lots of practitioners and organisations are thinking about. This idea about how to use data to inform the services that we provide children and their families. So just a few words around our webinar series. As I've mentioned, this is the end of our series, but we're really fortunate to be able to bring you some further webinars through the MHPN online conference series entitled Working Better Together. And throughout the weeks of that online conference, Emerging Minds will be partnering with MHPN to bring you topics including the effects of adverse experiences on children and working with parents who have experienced adverse childhood experiences. These will be held on the Thursday the 23rd of May and Thursday the 6th of June respectively. So please, if you want any more details on that or would like to register, please do so at www.mhpnconference.org.au. So tonight's panel, really pleased to be able to introducing Professor Leonie Segal, who's a foundational chair in health economics and social policy at the University of South Australia. And Leonie, we know from your background that you have a long history in using data to support effective service design and delivery for children. So can you tell us, why do you think the use of data is so important?
Essentially, if we want to do the best for children and their families, we really need to understand about them. We need to understand about their needs. We need to understand what difference what we do makes. Otherwise, actually, there's always a possibility we can make things worse rather than better. So essentially, information is critical both to our own clinical practice, to understanding a bit what the border system should look like, and then feeding some of that back to policymakers in an advocacy role.
Yeah, thank you, Leonie. I really look forward to hearing a little bit more about that tonight. Our next guest tonight, really pleased to welcome Dr. Jamie Lee, who is the Principal Researcher and Counselling Psychologist at Relationships Australia, South Australia. And Jamie, I know that Relationships Australia, South Australia have used family doors in recent years to really understand the effects of parent behaviour on the safety and the social and emotional wellbeing of children. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thanks, Dan. The Relationships Australia, South Australia has been using the three-part doors framework to identify, elaborate and assess the common risks that we know from the evidence are likely to be playing a role in the lives of children, their parents and families more generally, individuals. So it's a tool that we use first and foremost for engaging with parents around those risks, including mental health risks, domestic violence, suicide risks and risks to children. And we're using that, as I say, as a clinical tool to engage with families. But because we've been doing it now for so long across all our services, we've now amassed quite a body of data based on all of the work that we've been doing there. And so in partnership with our collaborators, the developer of Doors at Deakin University, Jen McIntosh. We've really got some quite incredible insights into the co-occurring risks that families face in systems, and we're really being able to use that to map out services, to plan for services, and to really thicken our understanding of the struggles that the families face. So it's really been an amazing body of evidence that we've been able to use to share.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jamie. So I'd just like to introduce our webinar platform for you all tonight, and apologies for that slight issue with sound. So the chat box for you tonight is for general chat amongst other health professionals in the audience. We're going to discuss resources that are available to you as part of this webinar later in the night. If you do need technical support, that's available via the technical support FAQs tab. There is a number to call if you need further support. I just want to encourage you all to please complete the feedback survey, which is loaded under the survey tab at the top of your screen. And we always appreciate your feedback, and it really helps us do what we do much more effectively. So the learning outcomes for tonight, this webinar will focus on the nexus between research and practice with clients at risk of abuse and neglect. At the webinar's completion, participants will be able to identify how to collect and analyse information about clients in ways that can improve service delivery, service design and effectiveness of treatment of children at risk of abuse. Describe best practice models for individual practitioners and organisations, develop strategies to collect, record and analyse data to inform and improve systematic early intervention and prevention of children's mental health, and identify how partnerships can be developed between practitioners, organisations, academic institutions and researchers to maximise opportunities for change and improved practice. So, we now turn our attention to the case study, which is about Jane. So Jane's a relatively new social worker who's really interested in understanding a little bit more about her clients, but doesn't kind of really know how to go about that. She's heard a little bit about data collection, but the term is not really familiar with her, and she kind of lacks a bit of confidence in terms of knowing how to kind of go about what she's going to do next. With this in mind, I'm now going to invite Professor Leonie Segal to talk about the issue of why collect data from a researcher's perspective. Leonie, welcome.
Thanks, Dan. So it's good to have so many people on board here, and clearly it means that people are interested in thinking about, ultimately, it's how you can do better for your clients. And to do better for your clients, what's useful is to think about, you understand more about them and what you're achieving with them, for you then to be able to feed things back up so the agency can better support you or whoever else perhaps you're working with and colleagues. And then ultimately so that the agency can then interact with funders and others so that agencies are better supported. So there's sort of really a number of levels in the chain in terms of the value of data. What do you want to collect? And I mean, that's really one of your first questions, is thinking about why you want to collect data and what to collect. And one of the things as clinicians is that you come with your own understanding and clinical knowledge. So that's actually a really good place to start, because often you already have some questions. And it's really good to drive research or drive ideas or drive data gathering from your own clinical base and your own sort of wisdom. But what I find is that one of the most important things in being able to do better for your clients is to really understand them, not just their demographics, although that's important, but their context. So particularly their economic context, so things like, so really getting a sense of their challenges and their strengths. Things like housing, income, education, language, employment, food security, and their social context. What's the situation in terms of family household? One of the things I think is interesting is that your sort of standard data collection instruments seem to assume that households are very sort of fixed in their formation, and yet a lot of the work we've done, we find that households can be a bit fluid in terms of who's there, how many people, what your relationship with others in the household is. These sorts of things can be quite critical to thinking about the services that people need. So it's not just, I suppose, it's really thinking about in a deeper way, what do you need to know about your client to really be able to help them. And the other, so that's one thing, is really understand your client. Another thing that can be important is to get some feedback of, if you actually don't ask your clients, how do you know what they think? How do you know what they're doing? And again, that really, if you can do that in a not such a superficial way, but in a deeper way. So both that they perhaps know how you think they're doing, and then how you know how they think they're doing. Is the service meeting their needs? How could the service better meet their needs? So it's not just about, do you like our service? Because most people actually will say yes. So one needs to go a bit deeper in terms of thinking about, you know, how could perhaps we do better, assuming that actually we can always do better. The other part of it that's important is thinking about barriers to access. So ultimately your service can only do good, or your clinical work can only do good, if people turn up, or if you're able to locate and work with people. So part of what you need to do, and that might be a conversation not just with clients, but people really who are struggling to use your service or get access to your clinical care, is to work out what are those barriers and what you could do to perhaps help them. Oh, here we go. No, it doesn't seem to be going forward. Oh, here we go. Oh, I've gone too far now. Catching up. So the other reason for collecting data, and you'll find governments often keep talking about program logic. Does your service, what you're offering? Effectively, basically program logic means, does it make sense? If you're sort of sitting down and thinking about what are you trying to achieve, who are your clients, what do they look like, what are their issues, what's their complexity level? And then think about, well, what do they need to make things better? And how does your service really match against what you think your clients need? So it's almost a sort of essentially almost a back of envelope test, thinking about who are your clients, what are you doing, would you expect it to work, and how do you think it's working, and what are perhaps the bits that might be missing? The other thing that's sort of interesting in terms of program logic is, are you also getting to your target population? Are you getting to all the people who need your service? Because that's a big part of, as I indicated before, if people aren't getting your service, then you really can't be achieving what you want to achieve. And also in thinking about that, it's actually who's missing out, because often we find in a number of programs that it's the most vulnerable and the most disadvantaged that miss out, because often they're the ones that their lives are sort of sufficiently chaotic that it's sometimes quite difficult for them to work out how to access the services they need. So that's a really important thing, is to just both for your own sense, because when you start just going through this logic, often you can pick up quite quickly where things perhaps you might not be offering quite the service you need, and then you can actually think about, well, what can we do here? Can you talk to your clients about what else they might need? The other thing is, by thinking about, once you've gone through this sort of program logic exercise, then you can start thinking a bit more about the setting that you're using to offer your services. Is it all within an office? Is there outreach possibilities? How easy is it for clients to get to your service? Both in terms of where you are, accessibility, lots of things happen outside of your standard 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So again, just, you know, the other thing in terms of collecting data is then to help inform how you might modify your service. So with some services, they realise, for instance, that dads weren't getting to the service. So some services put on, for instance, parenting or playgroup programs for dads on a Saturday morning. So if you look a bit at your client population, who's not getting there, what does it mean for how you need to redesign your service? Does it work for all client targets? So again, if you think you're missing groups of your population who should be there? How do you make it more attractive? So it's not just about cultural competence, it also can be about, as I said, where you're located, hours a day, things like that. And the other point in terms of collecting data is if you understand more about your client population, what their needs are, it might become obvious that, hey, things like food and diet is important. Do we have a dietitian on our service? Things like they keep getting chucked off Centrelink payments, and if they haven't got any money coming in, then everything falls apart. Do you have someone in the service who can advocate around those sorts of issues? So I think, as I said, that core about really understanding your client population is hugely important for that. And particularly that issue of not just interdisciplinary within your service, but what other agencies do you need to be able to engage with, and perhaps have some special relationships. So it's really easy for your clients to be able to move between agencies as they need, or can you actually have a co-located thing where different agencies, you might have drug and alcohol workers come into your facility, or as I said, perhaps a dietitian. So think about how you can make it easy for your client. So the other part of collecting data is that ultimately you can't provide a service unless your agency, your work gets funded. And part of getting funded is for the funders to have some confidence that you're achieving the sorts of outcomes that they think are important and that the program's meant to deliver, or even that perhaps you can help define what's important, because sometimes actually the funders get a bit wrong as to what's really important for your client population. So hopefully you can even inform some of those outcomes. Often people are stuck with KPIs, and you look at the KPIs and you're thinking, actually, these performance indicators don't really make a lot of sense for our clients. So perhaps you can even feed back as to what those KPIs should be. So it's important to think about what are your client outcomes? Is it working? I mean, often clients are very polite and say, yes, we love your service, but is it really achieving the outcomes that you hope it will? And invariably you'll find there's lots of studies seem to find that roughly a third of clients get great benefit, a third of clients get perhaps a little benefit, and then there's a third for whom you're not getting any value at all. And just even thinking about not just sort of average outcomes, but which of the groups are you doing really well for, and perhaps which of the groups you're not doing so well for, and how you could do better for them. And even size of benefit, it's one thing to say someone says, yeah, I like this program, but is it really materially changing their life course? Or could it even potentially change their life course? And what about your programs working? What about it isn't working, and what might need to change? And thinking about what you can change: eligibility criteria, service components, intensity, skill sets, caseload, funding models. I mean, sometimes the work we do in evaluation is particularly to help agencies in their conversations with funders, not just about, yes, you need to keep funding our service, but actually you're funding at a caseload of 25. If you understood the complexity of these clients, you'll realise a caseload of 25 is really unrealistic. So that can help build a case for a whole different funding model. So there's all sorts of reasons for collecting data. And as I said, service continuity is critical, and providing information back to funders is important to help keep the money coming in. The other thing that's important is thinking about advocacy, what needs to change outside your service, if really, particularly around mental health work, if you've got people who are homeless, it's extraordinarily difficult to solve their mental health issues until they can actually have some sort of secure housing. So I think part of the role is advocating for clients around the broader social sort of welfare net. I mean, what else do people need? Things like the New Start allowance, it is not enough to live on. If there's not enough public housing, sometimes the individuals themselves have zero capacity to advocate for themselves, and I think they need the agencies to do that. I mean, there's some great work with people like in Alice Springs. They've been doing a heap of work advocating about alcohol. You know, a lot of their clients have major issues with alcohol, which then creates the milieu for domestic violence. They've been very active in advocating for restricting alcohol or alcohol hours, etc. Some new policies have come in partly through the advocacy of these organisations, and basically they've halved the rate of alcohol-related domestic violence, ED presentations for alcohol-related assaults, etc. So there's lots of reasons for collecting data, and can create a community of interest that then has that capacity to advocate. How to make it happen? So start conversations, engage the entire service, liaise with colleagues if you're on your own. Hopefully an agency will have a continuous quality assurance staff, or if they don't, advocate for such, because it's very difficult to really do your best possible work if there's no information for you to enable you to understand who your clients are and how you can better work with them. And it's very difficult to do that all on your own. Partner with academics. That can be formal or informal. Lots of people are happy just to have a casual chat if you just want to, throw some ideas around, or potentially put up sort of joint funding applications. LHN, the local health networks, are often available to provide some support, or seek specific funding, for instance, philanthropic. So, for example, I know clinicians who have gone to philanthropists to provide some support for them to collect data on their clients. So, example, a different area, but of a dietitian who managed to get some philanthropic money to look at the advantage of having a dietitian working with obese pregnant women, and was able to identify a very large reduction in caesarean section rates and gestational diabetes through that program, with the aim of then having an ongoing support for the hospital to fund a dietitian in that service. I'd have to say the hospital didn't come up and fund the dietitian, but it was a good start. The other thing, if one really has a absolute burning need to do some very intensive and in-depth work, then postgraduate research program enrolling in a PhD is a really great thing to do. Example being Jackie Amos, who's a senior child psychiatrist, and did her PhD with me. She was working with mothers and children with intergenerational abuse histories, and she's given a webinar here, and really wanted to understand more about who were her clients. Why was she had a program which was sort of working, wanting to understand more about how it was working and how she could improve it, and enrolled in a 4-year PhD program to better understand exactly what was going on for those clients. And really the result was an extraordinary depth of understanding that really helped improve the quality of that work. We're nearly finished here. So thinking about, in terms of collecting data, there's probably already data being collected by your practice, given that a lot of people have to report to a whole lot of KPIs. People like the Australian Bureau of Statistics, the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, they publish lots of information around child maltreatment, mental health. There's a lot of surveys, the longitudinal study of Australian children, longitudinal study of Indigenous children, the household labour dynamics survey. So there's quite a lot of information out there. And really, often with a sort of a click on your web browser, you can find lots of important stuff. And if you want to actually ultimately collect some information, then you don't have to make up all the questions yourself. There's lots of questionnaires out there. So the Strengths and Difficulty questionnaire, depression, anxiety, stress scale, their mental health surveys, the first for children, the other for adults. Very simple, very short questionnaires which are readily available. The other thing in terms of collecting data, you might need to know whether you need to get ethics approval and informed consent, and whether, if you want to ask clients information, is it okay for you to collect it, or are they not necessarily going to be honest? Do you need to have an independent person collecting it? And there's sort of pros and cons about that, and there are things to think through. Ultimately, sort of things are moving towards administrative data, so thinking about within the organisation, are there ways of linking into administrative data, particularly things like child protection, hospital data, birth records. So there's all sorts of lots of information. And ultimately think about, where you can get help, because it's by no means an easy task, and it takes to actually collect the right data and analyse it. It's quite challenging. Probably don't really have time to, I'll just very quickly look at this. So this is just some work that we did for Central Australian Aboriginal Congress, and we were looking at, as part of their evaluating their intensive family support service for families where there was substantiated neglect. And one of the things we were trying to establish for government was just how complex these families were. And one of the things we identified was that 68% of families had at least 5 major serious child protection concerns. There are things like domestic violence, drug and alcohol addiction, medical neglect, physical abuse. So it wasn't just 1 or 2 things, and that was really critical in, really talking to the government about sort of what's a reasonable caseload for that service. This was also something where we looked at an infant home visiting program and just trying to look at how many children had actually completed the program. Until we'd done this work, they had no idea how many children had actually completed this. So the program, so we actually could look at how many children stayed or how many parents stayed with the program. They could join the program anytime during pregnancy and stay till the child was 2 years old. Through this, we found out that 41% stayed till the child was 2 years of age, and look at when they dropped off, and that was really valuable information for the client. But also we then able to compare it with other services and find that actually they performed very well. This was another study looking at the relationship between complexity and adversity, between mental illness in children and adversity. So one of the things we were trying to explore was whether children who experience psychological distress, whether they also had lots of other things going on in the household. Because if that's the case, then just having a simple, say, program around anxiety or depression wasn't going to work if you didn't also look at what was happening in the family context. And what we found, so this is an example that for children who are 8 or 9 years old, then, and this is the children who are experiencing very high or extreme distress. So of these children, 76% of them had 4 or more really serious adversities going on within the last 12 months in their household, and only 2% had none or one of these adversities. So it gives you a sense of it's very hard to do mental health work without really being able to work in a broader family context and help family. But without having done this analysis, we wouldn't have really known that. So just concluding points, so thinking about who are your clients? I think these are some of the important questions. What's the program logic? Is it sound? Is what you're doing working, and what might need to change? Think about what data you're already collecting, the capacity within your organisational practice to assist. You probably might want to develop, like a 5 or 10 year data plan. It's not something you do overnight. And look at how you could form some partnerships to help you do that. But actually there are huge potential rewards in collecting data, and it's undoubtedly, it's a really good way of ultimately doing better for your clients. Thank you.
Thanks, Leonie. Really appreciate that. Some really great practical advice for all of us, really, who are wanting to use data much more effectively in the services that we provide. So we are now going to move on to our second guest, who you've already been introduced to, and that's Dr. Jamie Lee from Relationships Australia, South Australia. Jamie, welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Leonie. Yes, so it's a Tuesday night. There's nothing like a good stage theory to whet the appetite, is there? So let's have a look at where Jane is up to in terms of the case study. So she's certainly been expressing some ambivalences, just moving to preparing to starting to explore what it would like to do, some sort of data-informed service provision. So I'm going to step. Oh, in fact, we've just seen a bit from the SOCH. Jane's still wanting to be convinced. All right, okay. What can we do here to support her through these stages of change to getting her and her clients and the service to be ready and really using data, getting the best out of data to promote family safety and well-being? So I'm just going to talk through some of those steps in this cycle, in this system, which is going to support change towards a very data-informed perspective on service provision. So as the saying goes, start somewhere, it will lead everywhere. There's a whole series of steps here, beginning with Jane clearly wanting to make a difference with the families that she's working with. Like all of us, she's certainly not in for the money. She's in it because she wants to make a difference. And she's just opening up to start to get some feedback. Her clients are giving her that feedback. And some of it is a bit unsettling for her. But certainly the clients are saying to her they appreciate the service, but there's some unmet needs. And there's some areas that they're still struggling with. The service isn't exactly overlapping with where the clients are. So really what this means for services, of course, once we start to look at this data, we've got a responsibility to do something about it. If we're respectfully collecting, using, storing this information, then we actually are interested in changing our services because of it. And one important factor, which Leonie's already mentioned, is just to keep in mind that not everyone will always get better after they do some sort of treatment, some sort of service, some sort of intervention. So we've really got to work out where is that sweet spot where we're able to really address client needs. And certainly I'm going to show you some data that really helps Relationships Australia, South Australia really get to that. So let's just have a look here at some of those big barriers that are really just stopping Jane and other people in a similar situation from really adopting. So the first of which is Jane has started to really address what could be described as overconfidence in practice. So there's lots of lovely studies around this better than average effect, the illusion of superiority that we all have. And clinical psychologists, there's an excellent study showing clinical psychologists, around about 2/3 of them rate themselves as grade A when it comes to delivering services. People think that they're better than average. That may or may not be the case, but certainly if we believe that we don't need to change, if we believe we're already doing excellent work, then that can really hold us back. So Jane has really pushed through that and opened herself up to feedback from clients. And sure enough, what she's finding is she's getting a fair amount of client satisfaction. And Leonie has already mentioned to us, people are often very polite when it comes to client satisfaction. So they'll use satisfaction forms to tell you polite things. You really, I'll show you how we're using our satisfaction in just a moment, but in teenage language, they'll tell you if you truly suck, then you will get that back from your client satisfaction forms. If you're truly sweet, you'll get that as well back from your client satisfaction forms. But on average, most people are going to say, yeah, you're pretty good, I kind of like it. But you're going to get either gross positives or gross negatives, but pretty much nothing else when it comes to doing that. And that's what Jane's already starting to get is, yeah, people are pretty happy with it, but it seems as though they're after something more. Now, another step that she's starting to take as well is to really relax into asking some questions of clients about how she can really make a difference to them. And what she's hearing back is some stuff that is unsettling, as I say. Appointments, for example, that's a classic one. I know Leonie has already mentioned that, especially for men or for people who have restrictive work practices, it's hard for them to get into our offices when we're in our offices, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5. And then moving on to another barrier for Jane as well, which is that sometimes when we're asked by funders to report back on outcomes, sometimes our evaluations don't fully overlap with the outcomes that our clients really want from us. And so again, I'll show you a chart on one of the ways in which understanding the client need gets a lot easier when we're able to reflect back on our data. And then finally, Jane mentions about numbers not being her thing. So they're not everyone's thing. And I know that's a real barrier for a lot of people studying, a lot of people doing psychology degrees. It's all rats and stats, and I find that really off-putting. So there are some ways which we can use information that make it far more accessible, useful for clinicians, and also useful for clients. So Jane is starting to see that, and we've got some other ideas. I know there were some chat questions, some registration questions around that, so we could come back to that if that's a particular area. But just looking now at an example of client satisfaction data. So we are asked by our funders for many of our programs to ask clients, are you satisfied with the service that you received? So we're collecting this information anyway because we have to. So we're also using that for our own purposes, just to look when we're doing some really large implementations of programs such as the launch of DOORS, our Universal Risk Screening and Elaboration Risk Assessment Framework. That was a big deal for us. But when we looked back over time, over all of our services, there was no significant change at all in client satisfaction as we progressively rolled it out across all of our services. And given that there was a lot of reluctance, a lot of some real worries from practitioners about asking some tough questions with clients, clients said to us loud and clear, it's okay, I'm still satisfied with the service. They're still happy to keep coming back. The wait lists are still as they always were. People were not declining to do this very detailed risk screening process that we've been using progressively from around about 2012, 2013 onwards. Okay, we did not suck in teenage language. We rolled it out and it worked well for us. So same for Jane. You will be told loud and clear if things are truly bad, but in the middle area, it's kind of most people are going to be relatively polite with what they're saying. So instead, another way in which we're using information to really look through how clients are engaging with our services is when we start to look at a few thousands of these risk screens, the DOORS. So I know you'll be able to read those on your screen as well, but I've just given some examples of some of the really tough questions that we're asking people. And in terms of client sensitivities, what we're finding is that people are still giving us answers, parents, people who don't have children, older people, younger people, are still giving us really honest answers to some tough questions, including, a really good one there, would you say that your former partner, the other parent of your children, or your children themselves are afraid of you in any way? So we find in our post-separation services, when we audit our files, we find that there are a lot of people saying, well, actually, they may well be afraid of me. There may be a basis for them to be fearful of me in their lives. So that's a really significant, so certainly not everyone, far from everyone is saying yes to these tough questions. But we've got enough data now to show that when we ask these tough questions, people are prepared to give us an answer because that's why they're there. They want to work on these issues. They really do want to see this as that's what's the beginning of their engagement with services. Okay, so let's have a look now at another way in which we're using our information. This again is Family DOORS, developed by Jen McIntosh and used by a number of agencies, including obviously our own and a number of other community service agencies. We started to split some of the data that was coming back into parents who approached us for parenting services, children's and parenting services, and parents who are approaching us for more general services. So that might include, for example, good old-fashioned couple counseling, so people who are there to work on their intimate partner relationship, not to work on their parenting or their children's difficulties. So when we looked back at an anonymous survey, so people could be very honest with us, it was totally anonymous. We asked people where they were facing a number of struggles in parenting and children's issues, and we've double-checked this and it still stands up. We find that people who are using our services for general support, for example, couples counseling or gambling help services, are having far more struggles with their parenting than those who are actually approaching us for support with their parenting. And there are similar levels of concerns that are being expressed about kids, or people, again, who are for parents who are coming in for couple counseling or for gambling help counseling, compared to people who actually want to work on children's issues. So why is this important? This is important because this shows to us that we really need to ask wide, cast the net wide in terms of the risks and how we're engaging with people using our services, and don't get too focused on the pressing, the rehearsed material that often clients bring to us, the pressing need, the urgent stuff that they really want to work through. And that's important for us as clinicians to just contain that and hold that and say, we will get onto that. That is important for you. But first of all, let's just talk about this fearfulness that you've got in your relationship, because that sounds very important to you. So look, really, we're able to do that now because we've done hundreds and thousands of what parents tell us when they present for services, and this has really changed the way that we're doing our service delivery. So we think more than just the couple relationship. Okay, and this is especially important because we get a large number of our clients. I'm sure this is the same for other agencies. I know it is because I've seen other people's data. Lots of people don't come back after one session. So if we're going to be influential in the lives, in children's safety, in their well-being, in family safety and well-being, we want to really ensure that we're able to zone in on the most helpful thing that we can do as quickly as possible. And we're able to do that because we're asking those tough questions. We're using the data from collecting hundreds and thousands of those, and we're using it to really plan out our service responses. Okay? So, in fact, I'm just finishing my piece here, and I've just noticed that Jane's back on the social, and she's just starting to experience her really first data joy, and that's wonderful. So I'm very happy to talk more about some of those things, but I understand that there are lots more questions. So, Dan, I just pause things there and hand back to you.
Thank you for that, Jamie. Really enjoyed that presentation. One of the things that I did pick up, if I can just ask you, is that 50.3% of the parents in your services are saying that they're sometimes or often harsh in their parenting. Has that kind of information enabled your counsellors to have kind of different or more nuanced conversations with parents?
Yeah, absolutely. So that phrasing of the word of the question, there are a series of questions around parenting, which are very beautifully crafted by Jen McIntosh and others. So that's a way in to talk to parents about a coercive cycle of parenting, or it could even be excessive use of physical discipline. It could be outright physical abuse. So when we're able to see what clients are saying when they're moving through either the paper form or the DOORS app, and they're ticking all these boxes or tapping on the screen and saying, these are the areas I'm struggling with, then immediately after they've done that, and when they're in the waiting room doing their registration, our practitioners are able to look through and then to say, okay, I know you come here to talk about the recovery from the affair that you've been talking about. I know you've been having a lot of difficulties with communicating with each other, but it seems as though this is really affecting it's really spilling over. It's the spillover into your kids that also is really important here. So how do you think your kids are experiencing this disappointment, this resentment that's really gripped hold of your relationship? So absolutely, Dan, practitioners are able to really relay back to clients what clients are telling us, and then to really thicken that up, to really strengthen that, and to, if necessary, to provide immediate support, and to really work with families around that pressing need around how their kids may be affected by the conflict in relationships. So absolutely, we're able to use that. It would be weird it would be weird for us not to be using DOORS in that way to engage with our clients. So yeah, it makes a big difference to us.
Yeah, and from your own experience, Jamie, has that enabled your practitioners to become more child-focused or child-aware over the time that you've used DOORS?
Absolutely. So there's some really wonderful practitioners that I know about at Relationships Australia working. We have some outstanding work going on in a number of our programs, which wouldn't be traditionally seen as children's programs or parenting programs. And what their feedback is that it really does broaden their avenues of inquiry, and it really makes a very holistic approach to family system, where they're able to use circular questioning around the effects of the struggles that the parents may be facing, that couples may be facing on their children, and it really does make us much more child aware. It really changes the way that we think about the layout of our programs, the referrals that we're able to offer, and certainly the provision of information in our services, because Relationships Australia has really moved on from being far, far away from marriage guidance. It's much more than couple counselling, and that's the same for other agencies as well across the country in the community sector. I think it's really helped us tune into to be far more child aware, for sure.
Thanks, Jamie. Leonie, obviously one of the issues for Jane, our social worker, was a kind of a bit of some
lack of clarity around data. So how can practitioners, in your experience, get clear about the data that is most useful for them to collect in their practice?
So I think that it really is thinking about the questions and going back to what Jamie said, and I suppose all the work we've done is that understanding more about who your clients are is probably one of the most valuable things you can do. Because if you really don't know who they are and what's going on for you, it's very hard to tailor your service well. And I think then sort of finding what information or getting some help from other agencies who are perhaps already collecting information and using their tools. The other thing I think to think about is really critical is that issue of who's not using your service, because often it's very easy to focus on those who turn up. So again, it's really thinking about what is concerning you. I mean, often you'll come to this with some thoughts about what you need to know, or alternatively, I would just say find out more about your client population, because as soon as you start doing that, then other questions will arise. That's a really, really good starting point to then work out what else you need to know, because once you get a bit more of a sense about who they are and what's going on for them, then already a whole suite of other questions will occur.
Yeah, and I suppose what we know about our most vulnerable and disadvantaged children and their families is that they often don't access services unless it's through a mandatory child protection or other type service. So how can you talked about the clients that aren't using our services. Can you talk a little bit more about how we might use data to know a little bit more about them?
Well, that's as I said, we were doing some work with Central Australian Aboriginal Congress, which is the primary care organisation in Alice Springs that effectively provides both medical services but a whole range of family support services to population in Alice Springs and surrounds. And they have an intensive infant home visiting program which we were evaluating, and we were informed that, well, it'll be very difficult to find a control group because everybody gets this service. And we said, oh, you sure? How do you know? Oh, well, we just know. And then and it's a bit easier there, but we actually they have some really good data files because of their primary care organisation as well. So they actually knew of their clients who was pregnant. And we just really did some work to match up, okay, who of their clients are pregnant and who's actually accessing the service. And we found, in fact, it was only about half of the women who were potentially eligible were actually getting referred, and slightly fewer were actually, and about 80% of those were accessing the service. So but until we'd actually done the analysis, so it's thinking about who are your target population, how you can get information about how many people would you expect to turn up, and that's where something like Australian Bureau of Statistics, there's quite a lot of data you can get at a regional level about who's in your area. And then what happened particularly in this case, once they realised that something like half of the potentially eligible women weren't getting access to the service, and that's quite possible that a number of those were quite... In fact, we found a group who moved a lot, were sort of quite mobile, and a lot of those were not really getting the service. But they then changed the way of getting referrals. So rather than waiting for another service to refer people in, they actually then started using their own data set to identify women who were pregnant and actually approaching them directly. So the infant home visiting program approaching them directly. So it really is, and even just thinking about your demographic, if well, you're in an area that's it's quite multicultural, and you're thinking, well, actually, we've got nobody African background, and why haven't we? So I think it's really having a think about, and as I said, you can look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics data to just see, well, what is the ethnic mix of your community? Are you getting, how does the ethnic mix of the community in the census, how does that compare with who you're getting? So I think it's really doing a bit of looking at other data as well to see who's missing, who are you missing.
And, you've talked a little bit about the exploration of data in culturally diverse communities. Are there particular things that we need to consider when working with these communities?
I think it's quite interesting. There's a lot of, obviously, sensitivities around language, and yet going back to Jamie's point, and I know certainly with Aboriginal community that we've done quite a bit of work with, and there was with this infant home visiting program, there's some very detailed and potentially very confronting questions around domestic violence. So not only very precise about the type of violence, hit, punch, etc., how often, who by, and there were people there that were there were some of the services who were concerned about these questions, and yet the response rates were very high, and in fact higher for the very precise questions than they were for general questions. So I think one of the things is with different cultural groups, because there are particular norms, if you ask people, do they feel safe? Often that's a very normative question, so it depends a bit on what's happening in their community. But if you ask something which is much more precise about, have you been sort of abused in particular ways, people will answer that. But I think the other thing is clearly to work with cultural, ensure that people from particular cultural groups are engaged with any decision about collecting data, so that, because sometimes there can be nuances that you're not aware of. So certainly any of the work we do with Aboriginal community, we always ensure that we have an Aboriginal reference group or Aboriginal people on our on the sort of the group that's deciding the questions and how we're going to analyse it, and even meaning. So even with working with Alice Springs, we always take all our work to that to the workers, including Aboriginal workers, and just in making sure that we're understanding it correctly. And I think the same with other communities, to ensure that they're engaged in the process, both in deciding the questions, how it's going to be, who's going to ask them. I mean, whether there's sort of male-female issues, whether one needs to make sure there's sort of a certain, people who sometimes men will only have men ask them questions. The other thing we found really a big issue with particularly Aboriginal community is there's somebody from their community they're actually not going to talk to because they don't want their family knowing their business. So there's quite a lot of things. But if you have someone from those communities working with you, they'll make sure you don't make any, really ignorant mistakes in what you do.
Thanks, Leonie. Jamie, one of the things that really came across in your presentation was parents' willingness to answer tough questions really honestly. Have you found that where parents may be involved in a child protection case or a family court matter, that kind of willingness can be diminished?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Dan, because quite understandably, there will be some groups of clients who are very reluctant to engage, and they may well be quite suspicious about the ways in which we as researchers or as services may be weaponizing information against them. So there can be a number of different concerns that they will have. So especially, of course, given the history of some white practices with Aboriginal families, has resulted in very unjust removal. So yes, there are some groups of clients that may prefer not to answer some of the questions that we would ask with our risk screening form, or may prefer to say these things directly to the practitioner. But certainly what we know is that, for example, women who are being victimized by domestic violence in relationships, what the qualitative studies have shown is that sometimes it can be helpful for them to be asked several times, those tough questions, before they actually then realize, you're serious, you're asking me this, you've asked me a couple of times, I'm going to trust you, I'm going to take a risk and explain to you what's going on. So certainly, like I say, being prepared to show that we're genuine and that our aim is to really support children's development, that we really here in order to get those foundation building blocks laid in place for children. Really being honest with the ways in which we're going to be using information, just as we would do in the standard way with our confidentiality agreements, and really understanding that there may be some clients that prefer not to say these things in a number of different ways. Although having said that, we've also got some really good evidence, again, from anonymous surveys with clients that have been registering with us for services. It's quite astonishing, but people, where they express a preference, overwhelmingly they express a preference for talking about some of the sensitive stuff, some of the shameful stuff that's going on, that they're doing or that they're experiencing. They prefer to actually do that using a form, such as DAWS, rather than saying it to their practitioners face-to-face. And that fits with a number of other studies as well, showing that people are often more prepared to be honest to an app, or to a form, or to a questionnaire, than actually to say it looking a practitioner in the eye, because sometimes it's a shame job being able to do that. So generally speaking, we do have some lower percentages of people expressing some of the risks in some of the more complicated programs like children's contact services, or sometimes specialized family violence services. We know domestic violence is an issue, that's why they're in the program, but nonetheless, we sometimes will start to downplay some of the risks, but certainly not dismiss, minimize, deny. The way in which we as practitioners are able to ask into those risks means that it's easier for clients to say yes when we're genuine, when we're respectful, and when we're clear with how we're going to be using this information for children's development, not to be punitive at all. It's not about that.
So part of what you're setting up, I suppose, in that assessment tool is providing practitioners with permission, for example, to ask a father about how some of his behaviours might be affecting his child.
Yeah. Look, that's a helpful way to frame it, because it is giving them the opportunity to say, this, yes, I'm here for this, but actually what I also want help with is this instead, in a different area. And so we know that you can't, it's simply not possible to be a man using violence in a relationship and to be really thoroughly dangerous in one relationship, and then to suddenly switch completely and to be a warm, loving, caring father to the children that have been witnessing either directly or indirectly the effects of the violence. So sometimes it's easier, and there are programs set up deliberately in this way and with this theory of change. Sometimes it's easier to go to approach, for example, men's use of violence through a parenting route rather than through an intimate partner route. So much as though it would be fantastic if men would really take responsibility very quickly for the effects of their violence, sometimes actually we do need to not lose sight of women's safety, but to go through a slightly different route and to think about what the look on their children's faces might well be telling them when they're doing this in their relationship. So yeah, it does. It's a new way for us to get permission from men to engage with them with the struggles that they use and the violence in relationships.
Can I just briefly come in there?
Yeah, please, Leonie. Yeah.
Just the other issue in working with people, and I suppose one of the things that just concerns me a bit with the conversation is sort of some presumptions about victim-perpetrator and how to work with people in a way that they will be perhaps more open, is to come from a space of deep respect and compassion, and recognise that pretty much everybody out there is struggling, and often their behaviours, whether it's men, women, children, whoever, is coming from a space of often their own distress and trauma, and often people's life history has been extraordinarily disturbed, not through any of their fault. So I think that's the other way of encouraging people to open up, is to make it really clear that you're not judging, you're not stereotyping, you're coming from a space of compassion and belief in that person. And I know that ultimately that can really ensure a sort of a more honest engagement, which can then help ultimately to support that person and to offer a better service.
And actually, I mean, if I can pick up something there, Dan, if that's all right. One of the practices that really seems to work well is to ask those difficult questions with everyone. So that also has the effect of showing that we're not singling you out. There's not something about you because you're a man that's using our service, and we're not singling you out because we know you're a single parent, an independent parent. So when we ask these questions with everyone, it really emphasizes that we care widely about family safety and well-being. It's not that we're targeting risk assessments towards one particular person. And that really, it's almost mundane. It's almost a very everyday, well, it is an everyday activity that we would ask widely about these risks and then to use this information in order to really guide our service provision. So if we're able to ask everyone, it means that we're not pathologizing any one person. We're widening, we're casting the net wide.
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting conversation, isn't it? I mean, certainly one of the things at Emerging Minds that we really spend a lot of time focusing on, that kind of that dual task, I suppose, as a practitioner to be providing every parent that we work with a sense of respect and compassion, but at the same time also holding aloft the necessity for children's safety and social and emotional well-being. I think you both described ways of doing that really well tonight. We are, though, getting towards the end of our webinar, which I'm sure you'll agree has been really fascinating. But before we leave tonight, I'm just going to invite both Leonie and Jamie to spend a couple of minutes just kind of with a final thought, a final kind of summary to leave with you with tonight. So, Leonie, I might start with you if that's okay.
It's interesting. I mean, basically collecting data has been and analysing and using it to inform my understanding of the world has been something I've been doing for decades, and it never becomes boring. I mean, what you learn is extraordinary. So, I mean, what you learn about yourself, what you learn about the people you're working with, what you learn about a service. So I think it's absolutely win-win to get into that space. And as I said, the sort of the more you find out, actually, the more questions you raise. And I think ultimately it's very valuable. I think the challenge is to find a context whereby you're going to be supported to do that, because it's not something that an individual can readily do on their own. It's not a simple and easy task to be able to go forward with that. So I think it's thinking about what are the opportunities to work. If you're a sort of sole clinician, what are the opportunities to get support by others? And if you're within an organisation, to really encourage that organisation to take the sort of the data collection seriously, because the rewards are extraordinary.
Yeah, thank you, Leonie. They're really great final points there. Jamie, I now invite you to spend a couple of moments just with some final thoughts.
Yeah. Well, one of the big messages for Jane in this case study would be to really accept, to take a breath and to understand that going outside your comfort zone and seeking client feedback and looking at what existing data you've already got and analysing it, presenting it, you're going to be finding gaps in service. You're going to be finding some unsatisfied customers. You're going to find clients who are not experiencing the benefits that you hoped they would. So being able to really see that this is going to actually help you to further refine your service and really to get back in touch with the hopes and dreams that as practitioners we bring to the work. I mean, that's really essential in this example here. So it's wonderful in this case study that Jane's already starting to do that. But it might well be that there's already lots of information that she, her colleagues, are already collecting. And it will be the same, I'm sure, for lots of agencies if they're collecting mental health care plan referrals from GPs who are doing DAS or K10s. You've already got the pre-measure from when they arrive, and you can be using that information again with clients, putting it into a spreadsheet and collecting it, and you'll find that you've got a whole lot of information which is going to really invigorate you as a practitioner and really help the work become so much more meaningful for you. So look, certainly, let me put it a different way if I can, Dan. There once was a social worker sent to perdition whenever she heard the words data-informed service provision. Jane said, numbers never were my thing. To me, client stories mean everything. And they closed the book before the second session. But after a webinar with MHPN, she upcycled the data around her and then added a dollop of statistics to see client characteristics that make families safer and coming again and again.
Wow. Well, I did not expect that as a final thought, Jamie, but I appreciate it very, very much. Thank you. That's awesome. All right. So I've been temporarily thrown by that. That was awesome. So as we talked about, there's some resources and further reading for you. So other supporting resources associated with this webinar can be found in the supporting resources tab at the bottom of your screen. And for more information about Emerging Minds, please visit our website, www.emergingminds.com.au. So we're an organisation which really depends on our work with practitioners who are working to kind of better the social and emotional well-being and mental health of children. So we always welcome your feedback and you getting in touch with us. So please, before you leave, spend a little bit of time and click the feedback survey tab for us, and we'd love to hear your feedback around what we're doing well and what we can do better. Certificates of attendance will be given to all of you, and that normally takes about a month. Each participant will be sent a link to the recording of this webinar and associated online resources within 4 weeks. Please visit www.mhpnconference.org.au for details on the upcoming webinars on adverse experience, brought to you again as part of our collaboration with MHPN and Emerging Minds. This webinar was co-produced by MHPN and Emerging Minds for the Emerging Minds National Workforce Centre for Children Mental Health Project. The project is led by Emerging Minds and delivered in partnership with the Australian Institute of Family Studies, the Australian National University, the Parenting Research Centre and the Royal Australian College of General Practitioners. The centre is funded by the Australian Government Department of Health under the National Support for Child and Youth Mental Health Program. So thank you everyone. We've really enjoyed bringing you this webinar, and we look forward to joining you again during the MHP online conference. Thank you.